All right, so I guess we will go from violence to beauty. So next will be Lyle Enright, who will talk to us about beauty becomes delight, or how does beauty save the world?
Here's the long first. Thank you. So I've been asking this question for a long time. How does beauty save the world? Which is a famous line from Dostoevsky. Beauty will save the world. Nobody seems to know how. The specifics elude us, and especially from a Girardian perspective, how beauty does its work socially and in the human soul seems like a really fruitful question. So what I have for you today is a stack of note cards on this question pared down to just a few. And what I hope is a coherent thought that we can talk about and take further today, as soon as I can pull it up. It is the benefit of a small, intimate group like this, as we can actually pull the threads afterwards. So the core question of this paper came to me while reading the Russian esotericist Valentin Tomberg and his Meditations on the Tarot. In the first chapter, contemplating the archetypal symbol of the magician, he describes the foundational insight of all mystical experience like this. And he adverts to the poet and playwright Friedrich Schiller. Schiller seems to have had consciousness of this insight when he advanced his doctrine of the synthesis between intellectual consciousness, imposing heavy burdens of duties and rules, and the instinctive nature of man in the Spieltrieb, or the urge to play. The true and the desired must, according to him, find their synthesis in the beautiful, for it is only in the beautiful that the Spieltrieb renders the burden of the true or the just light. In other words, he who sees the beauty of that which he recognizes as true cannot fail to love it. And in loving it, the element of constraint in the duty prescribed by the true will disappear. Duty becomes a delight. This passage arrests me for several reasons. First of all, because it sounds nice. It's this kind of attention without effort that Tomberg associates with the magician. It sounds like a life I'd want to live, experiencing a relative continuity between living justly and living beatifically under an easy yoke, as Christ called it. If the ideal human condition is play, then I am here for it, and I want to figure out what it means. And it also seems to comport with certain elements of lived experience. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, I will never pronounce that name correctly, but his psychological research on flow states is enjoying a new place in the spotlight of productivity culture, self-optimization culture. But whatever those gurus tell us, I think we all know what he's talking about, what it feels like to be in the pocket, he says, whether in thought, in art. This is described in athletes quite frequently, where everything but the work seems to disappear and we are overcome with the gratuity of the thing itself and our presence to it. We experience what the theologian Bernard Lonergan calls a retreat from personal differentiation into a more vital unity, a state not unlike what Paulo Diego Bubbio and René Girard himself suggest is the most significant measure of great art, the catharsis of liberation from metaphysical desire, and the seeming transformation of both self and time that results from that catharsis. So I find Tomberg's synthesis of human desire, perception, ethics, I find it all very curious from a Girardian perspective. At the core, prior to the state of play, he suggests a tension between intellectual consciousness and its instinct and humanity's instinctive nature, a tension that Girard, of course, thoroughly explored in his mimetic explanation of hominization and the birth of culture. This tension exists between the heavy burdens of duties and rules humanity places upon its intellectual consciousness, which we might here read as the religious management of mimetic desire, and the instinctive nature of man, the fearsome force of desire itself, I would say. Between these two lies what Schiller calls the Spieltrieb, and which Thomberg associates with mysticism and creativity, and which I here want to explore as a kind of post-mimetic state that can only be arrived at through mimesis, and its attendant ethical implications. Schiller is an interesting figure to bring into this conversation because Girard really doesn't seem to have been as interested in Schiller as he is in the poet Hölderlin, who took Schiller as his model only to drive himself into a mimetic crisis. Hölderlin's rivalry with Schiller preoccupies Girard at several points, but Schiller himself is kind of off to the side, and this is, to use a technical term, a bummer. Because Schiller's philosophy, thanks Noah, Schiller's philosophy in The Aesthetic Education of Man offers at least 3 points of interest for mimetic theory, I think. One, among the German Romantics, he is unique in maintaining a healthy respect for human finitude and contingency, while those around him tended to deify the human. 2, he, like Girard, maintains a strict connection between aesthetics and ethics, instead of letting aesthetics kind of float free to undergird what Girard calls the romantic lie. And 3rd, he sees a kind of primal rivalry at the heart of being human. This is not to say that Schiller isn't himself a victim of the romantic lie in many ways. He is still among what Hans Urs von Balthasar terms the romantic Titanists, who view human intelligence as infinite and subjective desire as quasi-divine. But Schiller's ideal man is absolutely self-making. Likewise, Schiller does not seem to acknowledge the intersubjective nature of all human meaning and desire, and instead locates the primal rivalry squarely within the individual consciousness. But already this shifts our focus in a way that I think is novel and helpful for Girardian studies. What do we do when we feel in rivalry with ourselves? For Schiller, human being is a contradiction between the finite and the infinite, between life and life's love of the concrete forms that it takes. Through form, we are allowed sensible perception of the absolute, but through that same sensible form, we are also subjected to change. This is what it means to be human, to be an eternal person undergoing change, or what Schiller will term condition. This native contradiction in the human being produces 2 drives: the sense drive, which desires change and novelty, time occupied by content, as he'll term it, the absolute reduced to matter. This is in rivalry with the drive for absolute unity, for wholeness, for the good to unite with the true, where one side of the human wants novelty and spontaneity, the other craves consistency and the enduring truth promised by abstraction. Part of us wants to be an absolutely unique individual, while another part of us wants to feel part of a species, of the we prior to any I. These competing drives lead us to 2 undesirable modes of rapture or aesthetic experience. When the sense drive leads, we are overwhelmed by the feelings elicited by objects. We become grasping, acquisitive, carried along by our sensations. Beautiful things cause us to act bestial. And now think of how this echoes Girard's reading of Pascal here, because Schiller, I think, is describing something very close to acquisitive desire. On the other hand, when the drive for unity leads, we become self-possessed before the beautiful through acts of will. We make aesthetic judgments, owning them from within our own sense of beauty rather than being owned by it. But we also lose sight of those particularities which allow us to experience this rapture at all. The beatific vision forgets what is individually beautiful. We miss the trees for the forest. Recognize here, too, the whisper of the romantic lie and the idea of a self-possessed subject who does all of this organizing. Schiller seems to recognize that whisper, too, because rather than coming down fully on the side of the self-possessed genius, Schiller wants to resolve this tension at the heart of human desire, and thus he proposes the Spieltrieb, a mediation that allows the sensuous and the absolute to coexist, to be simultaneously satisfied. In this state of play, the human being is absolutely free of all constraints. It enables us to both recognize and produce the beautiful as that which allows us to resolve the paradox inside ourselves, a paradox that extends into the realm of ethics, where humanity's ethical duties are in tension with humanity's absolute freedom. In the beautiful, however, Schiller says that this further paradox is also resolved because the beautiful compels us into ethical duty. As Tomberg further implies, something about aesthetic experience removes not so much the constraints prescribed by truth and duty, but rather the experience of constraint as a constraint, such that duty becomes a delight. Now, does Schiller's philosophy actually achieve a synthesis that strikes to the heart of the human condition? I don't think he quite gets there. Schiller still seems to fall into the romantic lie, and indeed the habit of play he proposes sounds awfully mimetic in some places. The Spieltrieb focuses on the willful arrangement of objects, placing them within a frame that reveals their beauty to the perceiving subject. The freedom one exercises is in their ability to attentively take all that life gives them and experiment with how those particulars might be arranged into different and satisfying wholes. The point, though, is that it is conscious, intentional, deliberate, and active pure freedom and will that requires a pronounced and autonomous I doing all of this work. And in fact, it is a process that must be taught to most people as part of an aesthetic education, inevitably producing the master-student dynamic, which ultimately undid Hölderlin as a poet. In fact, it's on exactly these grounds that Immanuel Kant ends up critiquing Schiller's Spieltrieb. For Kant, Schiller's transmutation of duty into delight is incomplete because beauty's role in the process amounts to a compulsion. Beauty is therefore manipulative, deceptive. Kant seems to intuit something like Girard's distinction between acquisitive and metaphysical desire at work here, that the Spieltrieb is really just the bestial sense drive transposed into a metaphysical key, occluding its object in pursuit of a deeper desire for being. As such, the freedom Schiller describes is no freedom at all, and instead Kant actually turns to the Exodus narrative and there reads Yahweh, the giver of the commandment, as splendid, as wooing, enticing adoration, sublime in a way that reveals the inner sublimity of Moses and the Israelites. Before such a beatific vision, duty is not a delightful compulsion, but a release from compulsion in an awareness of one's own capacity to choose what they will serve. In other words, beauty always presents a choice. Von Balthasar unpacks as much, extending Kant's critique of Schiller into a properly theological idiom. The classical idea that beauty and goodness are one and the same is realized on earth through, quote, ethical renunciation, expressly through a preference of choice, through the distinguishing of deep joy from superficial pleasure. Something about the beautiful leads us not so much to organize, but to choose one thing over another, to make a distinction between depth and superficiality, a distinction which is itself an interruption of the mimetic process. Beauty forces us to recognize the diverse streams of mimetic desire that make us who we are, and having recognized them for what they are, to then choose among them and reject others. The beautiful calls forth the true human sovereignty beneath the romantic lie. It summons not a compulsion, but a mimetically conscious surrender in response to being wooed. This wooing is also central to Girard's own aesthetics of the novel. In his essay, Literature and Christianity, A Personal View, he recapitulates his reading of Proust's In Search of Lost Time, noting that the novelist only becomes great when he receives, through pure gratuity, a perspective that, quote, frees him from the compulsion of desire, of the hope of fulfilling himself through desire. He is instead wooed by something he can't quite understand, experiencing a proper conversion in the sense of metanoia, open-ended, moving towards a totally unpredictable future. Furthermore, it's Proust's awareness of the difference between himself as compelled by desire and himself as liberated from desire that propels his genius. And his writing bears a formal signature not only of the author's appropriation of his own contingency, but also the sense of distance between the I who has playfully appropriated his own contingency and the I who at one point did not or did not know how. It's that that mimetically enmeshed I who is tranquilly and graciously recollected in the end of the novel, adding to the depth of the final work. If Girard describes human experience as essentially religio-legal at the foundations of culture, then Schiller, Tomberg, von Balthasar, and others all appear to suggest that beauty facilitates some practical transformation in the subject so formed. Not by removing religious and legal burdens, but by bending them towards new forms of liberation and play, which reorient desire in a properly transcendental direction. To properly appreciate this insight, however, we must lean in with Girard to recognize that our chief ethical duty is first to liberate ourselves from metaphysical desire and to live in the catharsis of this release, as opposed to the duties prescribed in religious prohibition, which merely constrain desire. One must be willing to see the form, as Balthasar puts it. And since for Balthasar, Christ is in everything, the beautiful also presents itself in the sheer gratuity of forms that we experience. Beauty is unsegregated in its self-disclosure. If beauty is going to save the world, it will be through a renovation of our own perceptions, I think, a deeper willingness to see in every object and in every other a potential choice to be fulfilled through gratuity rather than through desire. So maybe a true aesthetic education, in the sense Schiller's talking about, doesn't consist in exactly the schooling of great works, risking the replication of this kind of model student or master-student relationship, as if the aim were to cultivate the right kind of desire in the student. The value in Proust is not finally that Proust encodes some great truth about metaphysical desire, but that we must read Proust to get a hold of it. The value of Proust is that Proust encodes his own conversion into an object that arouses desire for a similar experience. And everyone deserves the chance to have those feelings aroused by Proust or by just about anything else. When one attends to how much feelings are aroused by artistic objects and why, then that's where I think we can get somewhere pedagogically, is the attention to the actual sensation of I'm willing to change in response to this thing. So what if a Girardian aesthetic education looked more like that, more like a community training itself to identify those symbols, those feelings, those values, which help us recognize our own contingency, appropriate it, live differently? How might we identify and cultivate the feelings that we'd associate with liberation from metaphysical desire, both through those objects which already arouse such feelings and the introduction of new objects which might arouse them even more completely? How collectively do we learn, like Mary in the Gospel of Luke, to choose what is better? In such a world, I think that the ever-straining I gets the chance to shudder, to relax, and maybe to stop trying so damn hard.
Thank you, Lyle. That was very good. Questions?
Thank you for the presentation and the how you basically framed a post-Kantian approach to the beauty before duty, and so comment tied to a question, not totally fair because Lyle and I know each other. So, but I worked in the slums of Guatemala City for many years, and one of the things that I struggled with was a friend who always told me, hey, which goes to the question I asked yesterday to your plenary, is like, if we can only act within the world with which we see the ruins, right? And all I'm surrounded by, he would say, is trash in a garbage dump. At some point, I start feeling like trash, and I start believing I am trash. So him and I have gone back and forth for over 15 years now, figuring out what was the moment and what made the switch in his internal perception of himself and his surroundings, that he felt the call of beauty. So as we are in this world of pain, the invitation, right, to beauty before duty, before I need to do what I must. I need to fall in love with something first and then discipline that love. So how do you see that falling in love and the discipline of that love connected to that communal call of beauty, but not only the call of beauty, but what beauty calls forth in us?
I think the most important place to start with that is where the gesture Balthazar makes, which is incarnational and therefore incredibly important, right? Because it's the incarnational move in which God inhabits earthly form that is a gigantic no to this idea that beauty only inhabits certain kinds of forms, right? Or that beauty can only be found in certain special arrangements of things, right? Beauty is demanding to show up unsegregated in just about everything. And when that becomes viable, right, to see like everything around me as a potential call, right? You get into this Levinasian territory that was talked about yesterday, that you and I have talked about before, where every other becomes this potential site of a choice. Trash itself becomes a potential site of a choice when your horizon of beauty is set by what my friend Anne calls the wounds and glories feet, right? As far as the kind of consciousness that makes that possible, Lonergan has this really interesting part that he pulls out of how does he put it? That creativity starts when you allow yourself to retreat from like the common sense uses of things and play with them differently. Giorgio Agamben says this is what happens with poetry, is like poetry releases language from the work it's supposed to be doing, the representational work, and makes it do something else, and that's what makes it creative. And I started thinking along those lines in yesterday's talks about ruins and the absence encoded by the ruin and what's left. And that idea of the abandoned airport is difficult to beautify because we're still possessed by that sense of the work it's supposed to be doing, right? One of the reasons a ruin can become beautiful is because we don't know, right? There's that cognitive distance that lets us encircle it with something else. I think trash is really similar. In trash, we have this closeness of this was meant for something and someone has thrown it away. It's not doing its work. It's surplus, it's overuse. And so I think there is a call there to ask, when people are throwing things away, when my home is becoming a place for people to throw things away, how am I going to get around the immediacy of what that represents and see something new and a new possibility of understanding my place? Does that help?
So just real quickly, I was wondering if you had thought about these questions in connection with Plato at all, because as you may be aware, beauty is a very important theme within several of the Platonic dialogues, Symposium in particular. And in the Symposium, what comes to light is that the essential character of being, of the human being, but of being in general, transient being, is eros. And eros is this desire for the beautiful. But the beautiful has this character that it can't be appropriated, right? You can't incorporate the beautiful into yourself. You can't eat it, right, without destroying it. So the beautiful is something that can only be enjoyed at a distance. It can only be beheld, right? And then the response to the beautiful, according to Socrates' mentor, Diotima, is what she describes as a kind of begetting, or you can think of it as a poiesis, right? a creative response in which one doesn't appropriate the beautiful, but honors it through one's own actions and speech. So I was wondering if you've given any thought to that in connection with these themes.
I'll shamefully admit that I'm far more familiar with the readers of Plato than I am with Plato. It's just a function of my formation and my education, but I do think that that's where Balthazar especially is trying to take that core idea of Plato and transpose it into what are the theological implications of this, right? And I think actually your idea of shame yesterday is getting at that same sense. And Balthazar also has that idea of the shame before the divine, not in the sense of like how dirty I am, right? But it's that ontological difference. The ontological difference in the distance. And I think that's I would love to keep working on that idea of the disproportion between humanity and what humanity loves. That is the signal for like the real transcendence that Girard is always talking about. That you problematized his distinction between like the sacred and the holy, right? But I do think it is this idea of like the human being is intended, is on a level of faculty, right? On a level of perceptive capability, the human being seems intended for something more. And how do we live more fully into that? So yeah, I'm going to keep going down that road.
Well, the best. Well, is Phillipe.
Then we have time for another question.
Hopefully this is an easy one. Thank you for your presentation, but so at the beginning you talked about sports analogy. I think of it as being in the zone. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's, and I think that's the
experience from a Girardian perspective, especially because it's almost like there's two different kinds of this like escape from personal differentiation, right? One is a genuine escape of kind of feeling overwhelmed. I don't want to feel the I anymore. But then there's another kind which is more relaxed, right? I think of like James Allison talks about like in the Gospel of Matthew, go into your closet to pray away from everybody else. And there is this kind of relaxation that happens, I think, where the I isn't asking the question anymore, what makes me an I? And instead is just relaxing into a being that allows the ego to kind of turn off. And I think that's what's so fascinating about flow states. It is the pursuit of a desire, of an ambition, but in a way that allows the mimetically generated self to kind of take a break and like not try and construct itself so constantly anymore. So yeah, I think like sports, art, music, all those produce that kind of states. I'd love to talk more about those.
Other questions? Okay. Well, let me ask a question then, and this will be a question for anybody. But oh, certainly, yeah. But this was, maybe it's maybe we can find some connections between these two papers, and I guess the question that I would pose, and this would be for either of you, is justice beautiful? So justice not in the sense of retributive justice, but justice in the classical Greek sense of dikaiosune, right? The virtue of personal integrity, or giving others what they are due, giving others what they are fitted for, as Socrates outlines it in the Republic. So is there something about justice that is beautiful? And we can even extend that a bit to think of, because Nietzsche, who you began with, right? So Nietzsche sees a connection between justice and mercy, right? Right. And so mercy is something like the limit condition of justice, right? Right. Because justice, although justice is bound up in a way with revenge, according to Girard, justice always puts a limit to revenge, right? Justice says, well, you have to serve 6 months in prison and pay $100 fine or whatever, and pick up the garbage, whatever it may be, right? Right, and then you're okay. Then you can join the community, right? And so Nietzsche makes the argument that justice is always bound up in a way with mercy, right? So it's not that you have, retribution on one hand and restoration on the other hand, but that they're intimately linked when justice is operating properly. So I don't know, with that as a preamble to my question, is justice or justice/mercy beautiful? Anyone want to take that up?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I believe that, of course, because Nietzsche recalls Stendhal's definition of justice as a promise of beauty. I'm sorry, the definition of beauty as a promise of happiness, and I really like that definition because it does not entails a sure outcome of what must arrive after my just action or after my approaches to beauty. And in that sense, I believe that the way that Plato puts it, virtue, justice as a virtue, is a work of art, a creation that entails not mimesis, but being, if I may say so, not acting accordingly to something that has already been done, but to correspond that has been done with something new that is linked by this similarity, but not identity, which may be beauty. In that sense, I think that yes, there's always something moving or something beautiful in every act of justice, or in every in every act of justice. That's what I think about your question. I don't know if anyone else would like to say anything.
Yeah, sure.
I'm just noticing a thread here between what we heard in the plenary yesterday and the two papers or presentations we had today. And I felt like you were going towards this, but then, it's time constrained and it's like you get to do what you get to do. But I'm sensing the thread of almost a compelling case of positive imitation through the call of beauty on each other, in one another, with one another, especially because you, Lyle, bring the idea of the community around it, around the process. And I can't help to think, but this, I'm maybe putting words on your mouth, but I felt like you were getting to the point of the face of the other, right? In Levinas, it's not only an ethical demand, but it's a softening of the harshness of representation. And as we engage with one another, I wonder if the positive imitation also invites us to the beauty of justice, not as revenge, not as vengeance, but as the restoration of one another, with one another in the process. So that's just like the little bit of the thread that I sense. I may be misinterpreting everybody's papers here, but
No, you're right. But the floor is not mine. It was yesterday for
Oh, good.
Then it's just for the speech of a person and the version of Venice, the mercy and the justice.
Okay.
I was thinking about it. No, you're right. But yesterday the question was when I can start. And I start in order, and then to go to the community. And in the evolution of Levinas's work, if I say evolution, there is also the importance of the sociality. That is, the other is not the only other, but it is the justice for all. And it's not by chance, maybe. Let's say in the dialogue between Levinas and Derrida, and yesterday we spoke also about Girard and Derrida. There is the commentary on the translation of this passage of the Merchant of Venice, and the mercy and the justice is most important than the only justice and the, like guilty, not guilty, and etc. in the court, but law court, but the mercy is most important than justice. And I think society, beauty, and also this new ontological way is a way to do not to repeat Girard, but to take into account Girard and what they explain us, but as he did, that is, he opened a new way in the commentary of the literature, etc. But it's up to us to continue, finally, in philosophy, in anthropology, in politics, and so on. And I think this link between the other, like one other, and the society is in the reflection in the philosophy as the one. You start with the one, but you discover that the one is opened. It's up to us to see again this openness, or to stay in the repetition of the gates, of the icon, of the etc. This team, they are important, but because they add some question, important question, and that it is our legacy finally. Continue in this way. Thank you so much. For mention, see the mercy. Just
I came in late. Do I need like?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, for the camera. Yeah, I came in late, so it's more of just a picking up on what's here. But I was thinking of the term like poetic justice and what we usually mean by that. And I think what we recognize in justice and its connection to mercy is that the person who receives its just rewards or their punishment it's their beginning to their conversion, because it includes humbling from their life that they were enslaved to. So like I've watched a YouTube channel that's all about like it's basically like interrogation rooms, and they take like, it's a 4-hour YouTube videos, and at the end of it you always know the arc of it, and that the murderer in many cases, psychopath, will get caught. And the catharsis is not that it's bad for that person, but it's good for their soul. And so we see the beauty in the life, the resurrection.
Well, that reminds me of Socrates' argument with Callicles in the Gorgias, where Socrates has this habit of arguing for the most counterintuitive propositions, right? And so in the Gorgias, he's arguing that, well, it's better not to commit any injustice at all. But if you do commit an injustice, it's better if you're punished, right? And then you have to think, well, what does he mean by punishment? Does he mean having someone take you out and flog you, or that sort of thing? Or does he mean the sort of thing that I think you're talking about here, where you really confront what you've done and feel genuine remorse, which is, of course, painful, right? It's punishing in a way, right? But it is, that's why we refer to somebody, who's going through that process as a penitent, right? Right? Because there is something punishing about that, but it's the kind of punishment that is supposed to make you better, right? And so in that sense, perhaps it can be thought of as beautiful. If only in retrospect. When you're going through it, it probably sucks.
But I think one thing to keep in mind too in the conversation between beauty and justice is that we're kind of late comers culturally, right, to the idea of beauty as transforming the subject, that call of beauty that transforms who I am on the inside. And so to recognize that proportion between beauty and justice is also, it's distinct from the version of beauty which is set up in that more compulsory way, right? I'm not out to change you. I'm out to, in that like Girardian early religion kind of way, I'm presenting you with images or idols that are designed to manage your desire, right? I am managing you as a person, not transforming you as a subject. And I think that old notion, that kind of infected notion of the beautiful, is very easy to carry forward, where the goal of beauty is to kind of educate you in what is properly aesthetic, what is properly beautiful. And when you appreciate what is properly beautiful, it will give order to your life, right? Or a way that kind of extends the community of control. And so beauty can lie by becoming the imagistic way in which we uphold certain systems of power or of control or of a certain status quo of the way things are. The idea that my sin is infinitely damning, right? Because, I'm proportionately offending the honor of an infinite God, is in the history of theology purported as beautiful because it is just, because it reveals this infinity of like just how bad you are. And isn't it wonderful to know the thoroughness of just how ugly and nasty you are, right? And so I think there's this real need to watch for the role or the work that beauty is being given to do. And is it remaining in that sense that we've been talking about, or is it being set forth as part of like the mechanism of control? And I think that by connecting beauty and justice, we get deeper into that problem and are forced to really watch it, right? Or another example that comes to mind, right? I've been reading James Cone recently, and so this idea of, how beautiful and orderly and organized is it that God has ordained a society in which white skin is at the top and black skin is further down, properly ordered, aesthetically pleasing, just as everything should be, right? And what is the perception of beauty that lets us blow that up?
And pain.
Well, I think that raises another question, which is, what is the relationship between the beautiful and the true? Right? Because what Cone is describing here is, perhaps some people think that there's something aesthetically satisfying about, racial hierarchies, but in fact they are not just, right? and they're ultimately premised on a lie, right? So we have three things that are going on here. We have the beautiful, right? We have the true, and we have the good and or the just. And so what you seem to be suggesting, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but if you are suggesting it, it's an intriguing idea, is that if we make an error with respect to one of these, then we may be liable to error with respect to the others as well.
That's why you have a double true. Yeah. Oh, that's all my comment is. Because it's a mix-up of what is recognized as... Yeah, just the concept, the ugly truth is a higher truth, misrecognizes because you want to replace beauty back to where truth is in that sense.
The way you are putting it, Plato saw the same question or the same relation, and he takes this problem back to what he believes is its source, and it's the deceiving image that things or that the world may put towards us, and especially through deceiving discourses such as those of the sophist. And what Plato realizes, I think, is that beauty and its relationship with truth and with good, it's not something that can be achieved merely by our empirical senses, but it needs, or it provokes a work of thinking, a work of philosophy that may eventually bring these elements together. As you said it before, we may find something aesthetically pleasing, but there's no truth that may sustain it or find it. And in the other way, we may encounter truths that at the beginning we are not especially inclined to enjoy, but these truths eventually they find a place in our lives, and if they are truth, they settle, and we come to accept them. And I believe that's where the process of learning or of growing up or of being comes from. But look, that's what I was thinking. Thanks to your intervention.
Other wants, but see what we had like. We're in a little time that, and I'm having.
There is an interesting. Balthazar does have an interesting way of getting at this, because he recognizes that there is a kind of potential problem in the convertibility of the transcendentals, right? If good is truth is beauty, right? Because there's this very romantic mistake you can make then, which is to say, well, if it's beautiful, it must be true and good also. And that's where this like kind of leading with aesthetics, letting it float free, allows aesthetics to kind of justify all sorts of crazy stuff, like racial hierarchy. If it is pleasing to me, it must be the way things ought to be, right? And so Balthazar tries to get around this by saying that rather than being like a proper transcendental by itself, beauty names the coincidence of the true and the good, right? Beauty is the name we give to the recognition of, oh, truth and goodness are operating simultaneously here. And it is good for me, it's good for my community, it's good for my soul. It has a form, right? The true and the good have taken a formal quality that I can see, and I'm recognizing that as the beautiful, right? So that to me is a really interesting way of helping guard against the mistake that if something is beautiful in the sense of being pleasing, the true and the good follow, and I can justify based off of that.
I think that would fall free.
He privileges the true and the good for sure, right? And so the analogy he uses is theological. You've got the truth is the Father, goodness is the Son, beauty is the Spirit. That is really the numerological relationship between.
You had said something interesting about, and I forget exactly how you phrased it, but it was something to the effect that there's thinking involved, right? Right. that because appearances can be deceptive, right? So we have to exercise our cognitive powers in order to see through the deceptions, in order to see what is really there, and I think that's right. But I wonder if we can maybe add to that to perceive rightly that there's a kind of spiritual formation that is involved as well. So it's not, and I'm not suggesting that's what you meant, but it's not simply intellectual, right? But it involves developing a proper kind of sensitivity, a proper kind of response to things, which I think is similar to what we were talking about earlier, right? Right. So, you can see the ruins. You can see them as ruins. You can see them as just testaments to something terrible that has happened, or you can see them as beautiful, right? And it is learning to see in a certain way, but it's not simply training the eyes or training the intellect. It's training the dispositions. It's acquiring a certain kind of openness, a certain kind of receptivity. And so maybe that is, and so I'm just kind of riffing off the point that you were making. I don't know where I'm going with this, but my thought is that to perceive things truly, which, and perhaps to perceive things truly would be to perceive the beauty in them, right? Right. So St. Francis perceived the lepers as beautiful, as lovable, right? He didn't say, "Oh God, man, I was a leper, but I got a duty. I have a duty, and I'm a dutiful. I'm not going to make sainthood unless I." So it wasn't like that. I mean, duty, and your lovely phrase, duty became delight because he could see the beauty of the lepers, right? And so the question is, well, when he's seeing the beauty of the lepers, is he seeing more truly than maybe we do when we see somebody and we're just repulsed by it, but we do or do not do what we think duty requires in this situation.
So I love that so much, because what St. Francis was seeing, of course, was the face of God in the lepers, right? So when we see, it's an incarnational thought that God is in everything. And when we can perceive God communicating to us, showing God's self to us, then it's beautiful. We call it beauty, I think. It's that active communication. It's the Allisonians. I'm sorry I had to walk out on you but I wondered if you got into that active communication concept and the incarnational aspects of that beauty is in the lepers. And my grandmother-in-law loved junk. she was a repurposer. So
yeah, we did get into that some, I think. Like, I remember that part. We did, in fact, talk about like Joel's experience with the trash heaps in Guatemala and his friend's transformation, going from seeing it as an indignity to, no, I still love my place. I am not trash, right? They can dump trash here, but they can't take away who I am and who this place is, right?
So I think there's another thread. I love threads, like I love to see how things connect in different ways. This is where I think all of these traditions, we tend to take away I would say the humanity out of many of the things that we talk about in philosophy, theology, social sciences, because it gets very comfortable. And again, as you were leading us yesterday, and as we enter into this conversation today, at the deepest level, the phenomenology of what spirituality is, the idea of what justice is and how beautiful it is, all of that, and St. Francis and the lepers, the trash, all of that, I think it calls us back into who we are as humans, and how we sometimes make ourselves too comfortable with discourse. But when in reality, and this is why Levinas has been so transformative to me, at the end, his phenomenology doesn't stop. He goes into, hey, what is the other inviting you to? And I think it's our humanity that invites us into that conversation, into seeing beyond, because the philosophical reflection can get very comfortable. But once we step out of the Colegio San Ildefonso, right, we hit the street, and then we see the collective other, and we're part of that collective other. And the beauty keeps just revealing before our eyes. And how do we respond to that invitation? And how do we engage one another? How do we model to one another, to use Girard's language, right? How do we model with one another and to one another what beauty is, so we can get to the truth behind what it's beautiful? And then I'll finish with this. I think that connection with the Christian tradition and the second Isaiah, in which the prophet says, and we saw no beauty because he was beaten, he was destroyed, his body was dismembered, and that's what we see outside, and that's where I land with let's call it a philosophy of liberation, to use the Mexican Enrique Dussel, right? It's like the philosophy of liberation, of finding one another, but also liberating one another from that grasp that asks us to dehumanize ourselves, even through our philosophical discourse, which is so tempting, It's just like, leave it up out there, but comes down to it.
I never thought about this before, but you bring up the second Isaiah connection again, and that also connects the beauty and justice component. We saw no beauty in him because we esteemed him stricken by God, or we deemed him stricken by God and we esteemed him not. We saw no beauty in him because we aren't allowed to, because God has cursed him, or we perceive God has cursed him, and therefore we see no beauty in him.
You think this?
So that we can we become also able to recognize them, the people all out this colleague, because in general they are ignored. Or the last something that's the annoyance that not really people that look at us. And we are looking. So this discourse from Girard, the word Levinas or whatever, coming back to Plato, etc. It's important to recognize the real meaning of reality, and it is a kind of gift for the highest to read again. And I think that the philosophical discourse is important in this meaning, this sense, that is, it gives up again the highest to read the reality. It is Girard that they discovered in mimetics, desire. It is Levinas, the other. It is Marion. It is Scheller. It is the Greek discourse. But it is a way to rediscover the reality, coming back to reality in a really clever meaning, not just to say, okay, yes, this is a poor man that asked for a peso, so I ignored it. No, this is the other that asked me. This is the important manifestation of our own humanity. Thank you so much. But thank you.
Yeah. Well. Thank you to our speakers. Yeah, and I think that we had such a lively and such a wide-ranging discussion really is a testament to what a fine job you did in getting the ball rolling. So thank you very, very much.
Per leading in, we decided to shift the chairs.